Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the next session in ISV. Chris Chandler, Microsoft Alliance Manager here at Greymatter. The next session is going to be delivered by Giles Davies from Microsoft, talking about developing together with Visual Studio Online. At this point, I will happily hand over to Giles to deliver his session.
Thank you very much, Chris. So let me just share my screen. There we go. Good, that's going through. So yes, thank you for that introduction, Chris. So just to recap, so Giles Davies, I work for Microsoft in the UK in the Azure area, and I'm an Azure application development specialist, which means I sort of cover anything that isn't networking and IaaS and data in Azure, really. When we were talking about this session, actually, so Greymatter and us going back a while, that was pre-coronavirus. So that was this was, I thought, an interesting area anyway, but obviously the ability, which we'll talk about, to sort of help people work remotely is even more important at the moment. So I think it's become more relevant with current circumstances, but I'll explain what we're talking about. So we're going to look at a new capability that's in public preview called Visual Studio Online. And I think to that end, one of the things I want to emphasize is, depending on how long you've been around various Microsoft development tools, is that we're not talking about what is now currently known as Azure DevOps, but used to be called Visual Studio Team Services, and indeed Visual Studio Online. So this is a recycled name. So this is not the same product as Azure DevOps. You could use the two together, but it's reuse of the name Visual Studio Online to provide a new and different capability. So I think a better use of it. I always thought that was a bad name for what was or what is now Azure DevOps, but I'll explain more, obviously. But where I think this fits in is there's a number of areas that we can help you to develop remotely. And those include these, so the use of parts of Azure DevOps, so Azure boards to manage and track your work, for example, maybe with dashboards and Scrum boards, Kanban boards, and so on. Microsoft completed the acquisition of GitHub just over a year ago, and there's a lot of integration now between a lot of our development tools and GitHub, but GitHub itself obviously gives a fantastic distributed collaboration tooling. So GitHub and GitHub's new GitHub for Mobile app to help you collaborate around things like pull requests from mobile devices. Those key areas. The one we're going to look at today obviously is Visual Studio Online. And so the tagline here is giving you a fully configured development environment in minutes, and obviously we'll go into that in more details in shortly. And sort of another sort of facet in this area is around Visual Studio Live Share, which allows you to share inside your IDE with others, so that you can collaboratively edit and debug and so on. So there's a range of tools and services that together can help you develop remotely. But for this session, we're just going to look at Visual Studio Online. So I guess the question around that really is what is a development environment? What are we talking about here? And it turns out really to be generally quite a complex thing. Is there's certainly the editor, the IDE, whatever tool, actual tooling you want to use. But around that, there are a number of other things that are important. So that'll be the tools and the runtimes, so the SDKs, the utilities and runtimes that you have on your environment that you need and choose to use. There's the debuggers that may come with the IDE or not. There are extensions that you choose to add into that to provide certain capabilities, and the way you choose to configure it and personalize it and customize it. And so when we talk about a development environment, it's both varies depending on what project probably and you're trying to work on, but also down to your personal preferences. So it can be a very unique thing for each individual. But there's a couple of things that I think this really helps with, and one of those is, and certainly I fall into this category, which is you may not want to mess up what can be a well-prepared environment. So if you take, for example, a work laptop, your development machine, or whatever you're using, you may have that in a nice, clean state. You know what's on there. And the prospect perhaps of dipping into another project to help somebody out, or trying to fix a bug on another application that requires you to install different versions of the same frameworks that you've got, either newer or older, or totally different stuff. That can be a little bit off-putting, actually, as well as the time and inconvenience. You may also be concerned that actually the environment you need may get messed up by doing that. So there's lots of reasons why I think we may typically want to have what we regard as our own environment and not change that. We want to be able to quickly and easily contribute to other projects without having to break our own work environment, and that's certainly one of the sort of areas that Visual Studio Online can help with. The other one which goes along with that is it would be good to be able to set up these development environments very quickly. So if I'm going to help out on another project that I haven't worked on before, apart from the issues of will it break something I'm doing in terms of the environment, I want to be able to do that pretty quickly. If I need to dip into another project to help out, I don't want to spend hours and hours installing stuff and configuring it and tweaking it. Equally, if we've got new starters, if we've got people that just haven't worked on the project before, how can we get them up and running quickly without having to spend what can be quite a long time just getting the environment into the right state where we can successfully not just view, but build, debug, run, whatever you want to do with that particular environment. So I think for me, those are typically the sort of the two big areas on this. Is I like to keep a clean environment, and I want to be able to set up other environments quickly, and want to do that. So I want to jump in. We'll have a look at this. So where I'm going to go is this URL. It's online.visualstudio.com/environments. So I'm going to drop out of my slides here, and I'm going to go into a browser, and I'm going to go there. You can, it's public preview, I think I mentioned, so you can access this immediately and start to use it if you want to. Later on, I'm going to explain about some of the terminology and pricing and various other things like that. But first of all, I just wanted to give you a sort of overall idea of what it would do. So I'm going to sign into Visual Studio Online. I'm going to use my domain ID, which I should already be authenticated in with. And so I can come in here. I'm inside Visual Studio Online. Obviously, this is the browser view. I'll show it from within Visual Studio Code in a minute as well. And what I'm going to start with is, this is one I created earlier, but let's go and create a new plan. And I'll explain a little bit more about how all these fit together in a minute. So the first thing is this will run in Azure. So what's going to happen is that we're going to basically be running a development environment that we'll connect to in Azure. It'll be run in a container, and I'll explain a little bit more about those. So I need an Azure subscription of some description, and I choose a location, the region that it'll be running in. Because it's in preview, it's in a limited range of regions. It doesn't really matter for my purposes today, but I'll choose West Europe. And we can come on to some other options, so we can give it a name. So if I said this is my VSO grey matter, let's call it partner day, something like that. So there we go, correct my typing. So we'll give it a name, and I could change things like the resource group that it's going to create for me as well. But we'll go and create that, and then I'll have a new Visual Studio Online plan. And I will switch to that. And then inside that, I can start to create environments. And so this is where we create development environments. So first thing I'm going to do is let's just put one in here. So I'm going to say this is my first environment. And we've got one that, I chose this one. It's in the quick starts, but if you want to play around with this and haven't looked at it, you can play along as well, or afterwards immediately. So this is in GitHub, but Microsoft /Visual Studio Online Quick Start. Just quickly to say on that, it doesn't need to be in GitHub. So it needs to be a Git repository, but it can be any repository that you have access to. And then I'll talk about instance types in a moment. You can choose between different sizes of container. Again, I'll talk about the life cycle of these as well, but you can also choose how quickly this spends itself. So how quickly does it become idle when you stop using it? And you can manually do that as well. And then I'll mention these when we talk about customizing and personalizing. But if you use docked files for your own personalization, you can bring those in as well. But essentially, I'm just going to create an environment, pointing at a repository, and choose an instance size. So we'll go and create that. And what that's now doing, a couple of things really to notice is, first of all, I'm still inside the browser, and I will show you this outside the browser after this. But what it's doing is it's creating that environment for me, and that's basically creating a container, and that container you can then specify what is inside it in terms of the environment. So what tools, SDKs, what customizations, etc. And because we pointed at a repo, it's also got the source code as well. So and it's also loading up Visual Studio Code inside the browser. So for you, I think the reason I wanted to start with this is that you can go and look at some, you can be invited to access another repository. That repository may have certain dependencies in terms of tools and SDKs and runtimes and all the rest of it. And actually, the lowest impact way of accessing that will be through the browser. You can directly go and look at that, doing what I've just done literally now. And then I can see that I've got Visual Studio Code. I've got the contents of the repository. So there are a number of files in here. And that this has now been loaded for me inside an environment. So this is literally sitting inside my browser. So a couple of things that I'll let's do. Let's go and open up a terminal. Get rid of that welcome screen as well. If I just flick between these, you can see what's been going on inside Visual Studio Online. So creating the container and so on. If I just come back to a container here, if I go in here and do something like uname -a, then we can see that we're running in a Linux container based on Ubuntu. And I've got access to normal commands here. So if I come in here, we can see, oops, I can type, put a space in there, we can see how much space I've got available. I can go and have a look at the directories, etc. What I can also do is I can see that if I go in here and say npm version, then I can see that npm has been installed, and if I come in and do node version, then I can see that there is a particular version of node installed. So the key part for me on that is that by accessing this environment, we've also been able to specify within the repository the tools and runtimes that are needed by this. So it doesn't matter what I've got installed on my machine, this environment, the container that this is running in, has got the right capabilities here. So that can really help you to simplify access to it. It's literally as quick as we've just seen. So I can now go to something like one of these files. I could, it's fine, don't worry about that. I can do something like place a breakpoint in here. And if I was to either hit F5 or go into the run area and say start debugging, then I can start running this code. And so, for example, if I hover over these, I can see the values, or I can go and have a look at more detailed debug information. This is now running. I can step into all of that kind of stuff. And if I let that run on, actually, we can see that this is running on port 3000. So if I just click and connect onto that, we'll see the exciting output from this bit of code. But we can see that there's Hello World from Visual Studio Online. So I'm able to access a repository. It's got everything that I need installed within that container. I can then work with it. I can make changes. Obviously, any changes that I do make, then I can commit those back to the repository as appropriate. And we can also run and debug this application as well, sitting in here. So let's a couple of things. We can go into, we'll see this inside code separately as well. But if I go into this Remote Explorer option here, then I can see that this is giving me basically the connection to Visual Studio Online. And it's showing me that I'm in this environment, which is my first environment. This is the repo, and it's showing me the forwarded ports. And you can set up more and do more of that here. So what I'm going to do is if we let's step back out of that, back into the Visual Studio Online homepage, if you like, for the environment. So I can see that this is the environment we created when it was created, the instance size and so on. I could choose to go and open that in code. I could connect to it directly here, which is what we've just done. I'll talk about the life cycle, but we can do things like suspend or delete. So if I just deleted that, it would literally just delete that and be gone. So you can manage this very rapidly, and you can dispose of them really as quickly as you, or obviously quicker than you create them. So what I want to do is the same thing, but this time from inside Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to fire up code. Let's get rid of the welcome screen. The only proviso here is that you do need to have installed the Visual Studio Online remote extension, and that will give you this Remote Explorer. And then you've got a number of options here. I can, if we were to do the same thing, let's go and actually click on it, which would help. You can do it. There we go, it's catching up with me. So I can come and do exactly the same thing inside code. So I don't need to go to the Visual Studio Online website that we saw. So I can go and pick basically the environment size again. And so this is giving the default settings, so the instance size, the location, and when it will suspend. And again, I can put in the repository. So if I choose the same one again, stick that in here. And I'll leave that name for now, and we'll say go and create that. What I'm then doing is creating a second environment. It happens to be pointing at the same repository, but I wanted to show you that you could do this directly from within Visual Studio Code. Just while this is doing that and creating the container and the environment for us, one thing to be aware is that you will be able to do that from within the Visual Studio IDE, not just Visual Studio Code. That's in private preview at the moment, so you can go and request to sign up for that. I don't know how long or how quickly that will take place, but that's in private preview, whereas the rest of this is in public preview. So I'm going to stick to showing you code today. If I go in here and say, actually, I'd like to connect to that environment, then I can just click on connect. And then what's happening here is the same, essentially, that we saw inside the browser. I'm still inside Visual Studio Code, but this is now connecting to the container via a remote connection that is then giving me the same code, the same repository that we just saw. But now I'm running inside Visual Studio Code itself. Again, if I go to, let's go and open up Terminal. In fact, let's compare and contrast. So if I come into my local environment and I do something like, let's have a look. Let's have a look at what version of Git. So I've got 225 running on Windows. If I come in here and I do the same, this is on 211. And similarly, if I was to do, I guess key thing really would be, again, we know this is a Node app. So if I come in here, we've got a version of Node running inside my development environment, i.e. the container, the remote container that this is connected to. If I do the same thing here, then actually I don't even have Node installed. So this for me would be an example of, let's say I'm focusing my personal development environment, as in the physical environment on my machine. I'm trying to keep it really clean. I don't do very much with Node, and I don't want to install Node on here. That's just something else to get out of date or interact with some other framework. So I don't have it locally. but because I can connect to this repository and that's running in a container remotely, then it can have whatever tools I want to have here, and I can keep those two separate. And then I can do exactly the same that we saw before. So I've got access to the repository and I can go and run it and all that good kind of stuff. If we go back into the Remote Explorer, a couple of things to be aware of here is that you can choose things like which ports you want to forward to. So we put in a default here of forwarding to port 3000. You could change that. So you can manage all of that as part of the environment detail. When I'm done with this here, I can say I'd like to disconnect from it. And then I'm just back to my standard local Visual Studio Code. This isn't connected to, if I go back into the Remote Explorer, it's not actually connected to anything at the moment. Similarly, if we go back into the browser and just refresh that, there should be 2 there now. Says here, why is that not showing? Never mind. Okay, we'll get rid of this one. And all I wanted to show you is that, let's say I think I finished with that, so we'll just come in and I'm going to delete it, for example. So I've got no environments in there. So right, let's return to the slides and explain some of what we've just been looking at. So I just wanted you to get a sense of what we're talking about with Visual Studio Online. So a couple of things I went through, I just want to spend a little bit longer explaining. First is just the concept of plans. So Visual Studio Online, as you saw, the first thing you do is create a plan. And each plan can have a number of environments. So I could have multiple plans with a different number of environments in each plan. The reason you may need to choose, or the reason you choose to use plans, you need to have one, is that plans are used really for logical grouping, and also, and I'll talk about pricing in a minute, but the billing aggregates at the plan level. So you can say the cost for all of these environments aggregates at plan 1, and we can see what the cost of plan 1 is. So you can use these both for that logical and if you want it for billing aggregation. There are some default quotas. So there's a maximum of 20 plans per Azure subscription, and each plan has a maximum of 20 environments. So these are the defaults. If you're familiar with sort of Azure quotas, then I don't know if this is the case here, but I would expect it would be when it comes into GA. These are quotas that a lot of them you can request extensions to those, so they're not necessarily a hard limit, although I can't be certain about this for this one. Sorry, right, just let me have a look at questions while I'm remembering. So the first question was, do we need to install any software like NPM or any other? No, you don't. And I'll come on to this in a bit more detail shortly, but the idea is that the remote container you connect to has all of that installed. So you will need to make sure that the container you're connecting to has the right software installed. And I'll explain how you do that. But actually, in terms of do you need to install it yourself? No, and it doesn't need to be on your local machine. The other one is it open source or paid? So there is billing, which I'll come on to shortly. Actually, so there is a cost for this that I'll go through shortly. Before I come on to that, because it feeds into that. Is that there is a simple life cycle for these environments. So when I created that environment, it's active, and you're then paying basically for an active environment. So that's the cost that you've got there, and I'll explain in numbers in a minute. When you can choose to suspend it, or as you saw, there's a default suspension time. So the default is 30 minutes. But you could choose after 5 minutes or longer or whatever it might be. When you suspend an environment, obviously it needs to be restarted to turn it active again. So there's a time cost, not very significant, but you pay much less when it's suspended. You just pay for a base environment unit cost, not the active cost. And then when you delete it, as I deleted the first environment there, then there's zero cost. So as you probably expect, but just to be clear, so you've got the maximum cost when it's active, suspend it and you drop the cost down significantly. If you no longer want that environment, delete it and you'll have zero cost. And to go through those costs in a bit more detail, so I mentioned there are instance types. So the standard instance type is 4 cores, 8 gig of RAM and 64 gig SSD, and that costs 34 pence per hour when it's active. So that's the cost that we're looking at for those. And by the way, the billing is per second as well. So although it's 34 pence per hour, that's divided up by seconds. So if you only use it for however long I use that one for, argument's sake, let's say that was 1 minute 30 or something, you're only paying 1 minute 30's worth rather than an hour rounded up or anything. If you choose a premium instance, which is basically double the size, so 8 cores, 16 gig RAM, this is for a container, then it's 66 pence per hour. And if you were to suspend those, then that will drop down to basically half a pence per hour. So not 5p there, but half a pence roughly when it's suspended. So you can see that it's not expensive, and a big difference in price between active and suspended. And again, obviously, when you delete it, there's no cost for a deleted environment. So you can have environments that are suspended. They won't be costing you very much at all, and then just fire them up when you need to. And depending on their size, there'll be those costs. So pretty cheap when you look at it per month, or depending on how much you're going to be using these environments. So you can have multiple environments that you host, and as you've seen, you can access these from either Visual Studio Code or a browser, or in time Visual Studio IDE as well. The other thing to be aware of is that this is the Azure hosted environments, but there is another option, which is you can self-host. In other words, you provide the environment, and you can do exactly the same things. You can connect from the browser, or you can connect from Visual Studio Code. And the difference there is that self-hosted is free, because you're not consuming Azure resources. Therefore, there's no cost from Visual Studio Online. So you could share something on your desktop, for example. So again, let's just keeping an eye on time. Let's give you a very quick example of that. Out the slides. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to come in here. You can see in the Remote Explorer. So again, the one thing you do need to install is the Remote Explorer extension in code to get to these. And what I can then do is say I want to register a self-hosted environment, and it's going to ask me the folder that I want to choose. Now, I've got loads of Git repositories sitting on my local machine, but just to give you an even simpler example to show that it doesn't even need to work with that, is I'm just going, all I've done is I've created an empty folder. I think it was empty. There we go, which I've just called VSO demo. What name do I want to give this? I'll take the default, which is the name of my my laptop. And how do I want to run it? Do I want to run it as a service? Excuse me. So it'll always be available when the machine is on. I need to be running code as administrator to do that, which is why it's saying not available. I'm happy to just run it as a process for now. In other words, I choose essentially when it's available. So that environment is then being registered. What I'm going to do, let's just let that complete quickly. All I want to show you basically is we'll just show you how it can synchronize across those environments. So I can come in here. If I go and connect to my environment, obviously not much point really from the same machine like I'm doing here. But what that will do is just it will now connect to it, and I'm going to show you from the browser as well shortly as well. So we're just connecting in there. Let's get rid of the welcome screen, make it a bit easier. And we can see there's not a lot inside there. So if I was to come back in here, I'm in that folder at the moment. And if I was to do something like, say, echo blah to text.txt, something like that. We can see we've got a file sitting inside there. If I come in here, okay, it's still setting it up. What I want to show you, this will synchronize shortly when it's sorted. I was probably a bit quick there. While I'm waiting for that, let's also go in here. This is the environment that we've just been using, that I've just created, the self-hosted environment. So if I select that here as well, just while that's loading, I'm now connecting, admittedly on the same machine, but it doesn't need to be. I'm now connecting to my self-hosted environment via the browser as well. So I can then see that I've got my text.txt sitting in here. So I've got that file. And so I can see that here. If I go back to code, we can see that file in here as well. And if I make a change, so let's have more blah and save that. If I come back into here and do more, I can see that's being picked up. So just even without a Git repository, basically I've exposed a workspace on my machine. I've made that a self-registered environment, and I'm able to share that with other people. Obviously, yeah, not worried about that. And obviously, if I'd chosen to point to a Git repository, then I'd be looking at source code and various other things as well. So I think an interesting other option for you to think about is that self-registering. So let me just quickly check questions while I go back into slides. So there's a question around, does it work with standard Docker Linux containers, not on Azure? So you need, if you're, yeah, so the containers it uses are standard Docker containers. Where you run them will then either be Azure hosted or could be self-hosted. So yes, it is standard Docker. You choose whether it's on Azure or not, I think is the answer to that. And then another question is, can you confirm these environments costs are in addition to Visual Studio subscription or not? That's a good question. I will double check this, but I think they will, if you've got a Visual Studio subscription, that gives you your Azure subscription with credit on it. If you choose to use that as a subscription, then you won't need to pay any more. If you choose to, if you, for whatever reason, you choose to use a different subscription, then the cost will be billed against that Azure subscription. So I think the answer to that will be yes. If you choose to use the Visual Studio Azure subscription that you get free credit for, absolutely it will be included in this. Bearing in mind, of course, that depending on the level of Visual Studio subscription you get a certain amount of credit per month. With the costs we're looking at here, I doubt you'll hit them, but obviously if you exceed those, then you need to work out, are you adding in a billing mechanism into that or not, basically. But yeah, I think the answer is yes. Basically, to your question, this will be covered in Visual Studio subscription because that gives you an Azure subscription. And then another one, can I use any of my on-premise or cloud-hosted VMs for self-hosting? Yes, absolutely. Yes, you can just point, self-hosting just means an environment that you control. So obviously, if you've got a VM in the cloud, then you are paying separately to this, you'll be paying for running that VM in the cloud, but Visual Studio Online will see it as a self-hosted environment and therefore free because it's not being paid for by this. And then the last thing I just quickly wanted to move on to before we run out of time, but was configuring this. So I've kind of pointed you at, we just got in, pointed to a repo, stuff happens, we've got a container. The example I showed you, magically Node is there and it's running. So how does that all work and how do you change it if you need to? So what happens is when you point it at a repository, so you can point it at any Git repo, something like that. If you don't do anything else, which I'll talk about what that anything else is in a minute, but if you do nothing, you haven't changed it at all, then you'll get a default general container will be spun up on your behalf when you create the environment. And that default container will include these tools and services. So you'll have things like Node and .NET Core, PHP, Java, etc. All of that stuff will be available in that generic container. Obviously, you may wish to have more control over particular versions and so on, and that's where you may want to customize it. But basically, do nothing, point it at a repository, you'll get a container, and you'll get these tools out of the box. So then the question is, well, how do I customize that? So the way you do that is you create a dev container.json file, and you stick this in the repository, and it needs to go either in the root as .devcontainer.json or in a .dev container folder off of the root. So either of those locations, you stick the .dev container JSON file, and that's where you then specify what you want to do. In fact, before I go on to the next slide, let's quickly go back to, if I go back in here, and we look at this one that we created. It's just reconnecting to that environment. What I wanted to show you was that in this one, there is a .dev container JSON file in the root. So if we go and have a look at that, this is a very, very simple one, and I'll talk about what else you can put in there. In this case, it's not specifying a different Docker container, so it's taking the default container, it's associating a name with it, and it's saying, actually, I would like an extension to be added in here, which is a linting extension. So this is the unique identifier for a Visual Studio Code extension. So if you go into extensions, I'll just pick one at random here, first one up here, then this is the, probably might be a little difficult to see, but that unique ID that you see there, so in this case ms-vscode.azure-account, that's the name, the unique ID for the extension that you can then add into the .dev container file. So that's the equivalent of that. So you can have an array of extensions. So in this case, what we're saying is when this remote environment starts up, when the container starts up, inside, once you've created that environment, inside the instance of Visual Studio Code, make sure these extensions are loaded. So that's essentially what that's telling us. So if I come back into the slides, excuse me, some of those properties, you've just seen extensions in there. So you can add in extensions, as I just mentioned, so you can have one or more Visual Studio Code Marketplace extensions. You can also specify Visual Studio Code settings as well. So if there are ways you like to personalize that or change the Visual Studio Code environment, you can do it. You've got two options, app port or forward ports, with forward ports being the preferred option. I think it's sort of app port is being deprecated. So you can specify port forwarding as part of the JSON file, and you can also run scripts as well. So after the container's been created, the extension's been added, etc., you can then run one or more scripts, including scripts that are physically located inside that repository. So this can be a self-contained environment. So here's a little bit more in there. So this is one that opens up or specifies port forwarding, adds in two extensions, make sure that certain color settings are in there, and then runs a script as well. So that's a collection of those extensions put together. And then there are also properties to change the Docker container as well. So I haven't listed them all out, there's quite a few. But if you don't want to or need not to use that default container image, you can also specify your own image. So you can build your own or reuse somebody else's, but essentially you can create an environment based off of an image of your choice. Or you can have it built from a Docker file, various other options in there. So you've got a tremendous amount of control around this. You can say actually, and I would imagine in the same way that you might have golden VM templates and things like that, over time, if you're using this, you might have particular containers that represent, approved dev environments for particular projects or technology types, and say actually this comes with all the right tools, use this container and it's got the right versions of the right tools and runtimes and all that kind of stuff. So you have a combination of the Docker container as well as extensions in things like VS Code and so on. So quick summary, and then I'll check for questions and things again. So for me, what's this all about? Just as a summary, so it's about how do I keep my own environment clean and not potentially mess it up with other environments or conflicting tools or different versions and all that kind of stuff that you can potentially have. So I can keep my own environment clean by working with a remote environment, basically. It also means I can go and try out new tool runtime framework versions more easily. I don't have to worry about some of those concerns about what happens if, the non-stable build of the next version of .NET Core or something, is that going to break what I'm doing now? And therefore, I think you can spend less time managing that environment, both for you and others. You can move to an environment where your physical environment is perhaps very, very clean, but actually each project or application that you connect to, it has its own self-contained environment, which is pre-configured and you don't need to set that up. It's just ready to go, and fairly obviously that means you can bring other people in quicker as well. You don't need to go through the whole, you need to install that, do this, tweak that. They can get up and running pretty quickly. And as you've seen, you can connect to those remote environments anywhere that you've got a connection. So that can be, you can continue to use your editor, so Visual Studio Code. You will also be able to use Visual Studio IDE. Again, that's in private preview at the moment. Or you can even just use a browser. So you've got, and then effectively running through code inside the browser. So you've got a pretty wide range of capabilities in terms of, maybe somebody wants you to do a pull request, a code review. You can connect maybe just through the browser. You don't need to have stuff installed. You can just connect to that environment, have a good look at it, and even debug and run stuff. So that's where I see it sort of fitting in. And I've put a couple of, so I think we're going to share these slides and things. I just put a couple of links in here to get going. So the general, that link I went to, so where do you get to Visual Studio Online itself is the first one. Documentation about Visual Studio Online, and that also includes things like quick starts and references and so on. So it'll take you through stepping through something. I've used one of the quick start examples, but it'll take you through that in more detail. So you can play around with this today, and just have a look at it. You need, if you're going to be using this within Visual Studio Code in your environment, i.e. not through the browser, you do need to install a Visual Studio Code extension. So I put the link in there, but you can search for Visual Studio Online inside VS Code as well. And then it's part of the document, so I've just called it out. More details on what I've just been through in terms of configuring the environment. I haven't talked about personalizing it. You can also use those .config files for your own editor preferences and all that kind of stuff as well. So a lot more there in configuring. So those are in the slides for, you'll be able to get those as well. So I think I'm pretty much on time, but thank you very much for your attention, your time and attention on that. I hope that's been a useful introduction to something that I don't think is necessarily that well known. Let me just quickly look at the questions. So is Visual Studio Online replacing the desktop-based Visual Studio Enterprise Professional IDEs? No, absolutely not. But I think I'd see it as a complementary tool. It's not giving you in itself the IDE. What it's giving you is the back-end environment, where all the runtimes, the tooling, the SDKs are sitting. So I'd see this being very much complementary, and it will fit with Visual Studio IDE as well. So I think the material to practice, so I think probably just start off with those links and the quick starts, and that will get you going. Other than that, literally going to Visual Studio Online with that URL pointed at one of your repos. You don't even need that .devcontainer.json. Just start having a look at it and see what you get, and then start playing around with it. But yes, start with those documents. So I think that's the so no, I think that's all the questions there. So I will keep an eye out for any other questions. I think they're going to be in the LinkedIn group as well, but let me say thank you again to you and hand back to Chris Greymatter.
Perfect. Thank you, Giles. Really appreciate that. And, fantastic session. As Giles mentioned, any questions, do feel free to put them in our LinkedIn community, so Greymatter ISV community on LinkedIn. Additionally, you can email info@greymatter.com or reach out to us on the phone